Been there for a while.
Thank you for joining, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order here. And can I get a motion to approve our agenda tonight?
I'll make a motion.
All right, Kim's the first, Pat's the second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Motion carries. Do we have any discussion about the minutes from our last meeting on August 1st, 2023? Are there any edits or comments on it? I'll accept a motion to approve the meeting minutes from August 1st to 2023.
Moved.
We have a first, we have a second. And we have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Do we have any public comment tonight, Lori?
I am not aware of anything that has been submitted. No, nope.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you then, Lori.
Great, thank you, Chair Cassie. Well, I do not have a long, project update to give you tonight. We met here not too long ago, but tonight we're going to start going over some development code changes that you haven't seen before. And subsequently after this meeting, you'll be seeing a few other code revisions and comp plan policy changes in the future as well. And some of the development code changes you're looking at tonight really are, some of it's housekeeping stuff, some of it's kind of things I've been thinking about changing or wanting to change here over the last few years. And this was a good opportunity to do a lot of this at once. And then the comp plan changes you'll be seeing tonight, some of it's just a matter of updating some language, modernizing some of it. Previous writers of these comp plan policies maybe worded things in a way that it was somewhat confusing, kind of what they were meaning by that. So we're just trying to bring everything up to speed. Some of the changes where you'll see like huge strikeouts were items that have already been implemented or are no longer relevant because we have no land in the city designated that way. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. And looks like Heather will be leading us off tonight.
Thank you, Lori. Good to be with you this evening. In the past, I've been able to speak with you all about a lot of your residential development standards. So tonight we're switching gears with development code and stepping over into your commercial zoning districts, the C and EC zones, as well as some landscaping, screening, and fencing standards. We put some street tree updates, really minimal for the code section there, as well as some ideas about parking area landscaping. So like to get some feedback from the group, and I will go ahead and pull up my screen here. Just a second. So let's start with the commercial and expanded commercial zones and talk about how we might change the code section to expand the permitted uses. Use the slot where? Then just open the, I want to open. Okay. Okay, thank you. Apologies, small technical moment there. So here's your, I'll just scroll to the top so everybody can see. This is your 17.62 commercial zone, general commercial, and the list of permitted uses. And we propose the same language in your EC expanded commercial zone as well. So if I just scroll down, you currently have eating and drinking establishments as a permitted use. You currently have a conditional use of outside dining facilities. So staff asked us to update this to allow outside dining facilities to be permitted outright because they're now considered really part and parcel with a food and dining facility. Any feedback on that?
That's good.
Okay, thank you. And then for allowing things like breweries or wineries or micro distilleries, or even things like bakeries, anywhere where you would have food and beverage service, but then also maybe a manufacturing and production portion of that as well. We wanted to be able to permit those in the C and EC zones, but make sure that they're limited so we don't have huge footprints of industrial type uses in those vibrant downtown spaces. So we looked at some other codes to see how they do it. I know there's Oregon City Brewery right downtown in Oregon City. There's Deschutes and tons of breweries in Bend. So we looked at those places where those uses are permitted to see how they do it. Bend uses similar language to this, where the footprint is limited to 5,000 square feet for the entire piece. Oregon City is much larger, where you can go up to 60,000 square feet. Some jurisdictions do have a limit as to, or a minimum requirement for how much has to be that retail or restaurant piece. So that does safeguard you from having, just a tiny little walk-up window and a 5,000 square foot production facility behind it. I don't know how much concern there is about that. Are there thoughts on this one?
I have Brian Rosenthal. I have some concerns about odor. Microbreweries and any kind of alcohol producing facility can generate a fair bit of odor, and it's inconsistent with having office space or other businesses. The odor can be offensive enough to render spaces around them unrentable. And so there'd have to be some sort of verbiage in there about odor control, and that it may not create an odor situation that's offensive or reduces the viability of properties around it. Other than that, it's great, but the odor situation has to be controlled, because otherwise they're basically robbing value from their neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is an odor section of the municipal.
Yeah, I thought about that too, Brian. And so, but we will need to look at that to make sure, because what we could do is reference back to our chapter. It's the environmental performance standards, and say that that needs to be met, and then look at that code to see if we need to tighten that up at all.
That's not in our environmental's not on our packet, is it?
No,
It is not. No.
Okay, yeah. Okay,
I can pull that up.
Yeah,
Since I'm sharing here.
I would like to see if we're going to put that there, then there should be some sort of reference back to environmental, and then the environmental should be strict enough
Thank you.
to
Sorry, clicked on that's manufactured.
it's 17.90.060 odors.
Okay.
The emission of odorous gases or other matter in such quantities as to be readily detectable at any point beyond the property line of the use creating the odors is prohibited.
That sounds great, but it should be referenced.
Reference
Yes.
that section back.
Subject to 17.90.060.
Yeah. Other than that, I like the idea. You could use a brew pub in town.
Great.
NJ, is there someone online?
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah. My opinion is 5,000 square feet is extremely small. I mean, if they have a restaurant and other things, you're talking maybe 3,000 square feet to actually, make any beer if it's going to be like a brewery. And, Bend is an interesting situation because, they have Deschutes and whatever with their manufacturing centers, elsewhere.
Right.
But I think we want to do anything possible to encourage like a small brewery that came in, but also be able to expand a little bit, up to like 10,000 square feet or something. But 5,000 just seems really, really small, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, the idea though is this is in commercial zoning. In industrial, they could have unlimited.
Sure.
We could put a new course plan in theoretically.
Right.
So the idea is that we're trying to, I mean, I don't have an opposition to going a little larger, but I don't know if you've ever been around brewing of beer or
Mhm.
hard alcohol, the larger the facility, the harder it is going to be to control the odor. And when you get to that size facility, I don't believe they could do it. And so I think it's like waving a carrot that doesn't exist. If we're actually going to make them honor the fact that they can't make surrounding businesses tolerate their smell, if they get too large, they're going to do it. So it's like saying you can do this, but not if there's a smell. But I don't believe there's a way you can do it without a smell that's going to be offensive to their neighbors. So it's kind of like waving a carrot that doesn't exist.
Is there a square footage size that you think is reasonable that would work?
I think the 5,000 is fine. If somebody said 6 works for them, I don't have a problem going up 1,000 feet. But, I mean, so like to give you an idea of square footage on and restaurant stuff, the little cafe that used to be on the corner there was 1,600 square feet.
Oh, yeah.
That was 1,600 square feet. So that would be 4 times the size of a small cafe. So that's
Yeah.
you're getting to the point where it's not really going to be a commercial enterprise anymore. It's becoming an industrial.
Although that does include the restaurant space in that.
Yes,
So
yeah.
you'd want production space and restaurant space.
And I don't disagree with Paul that you might need 3,000 square feet for the brewing part. So if you wanted to bump it to 6,000, that's fine. But I think if you go to 10, I just don't know how they're going to do 10,000 square feet operation and not create an odor issue for their neighbors.
Jeanette?
We've reached out to people that are actually experts in this, that have breweries and distilleries that they know what a typical size would be, or if there any interest in any companies that are willing to come and they would want
Don't-
X amount of.
Yeah, no, I don't think we've done that.
I haven't reached out. I don't know if there's been any interest in Skephoos that you've had.
There is, but this gentleman ended up purchasing a building in St. Helens, kind of near the waterfront to produce.
Big was that?
It's the old dockside. So we'd have to look at the size of that. And I don't know if he's brewing on site because I think he got permission to brew. He's not even
Lori-
brewing on site.
Yeah, Lori, he's not, Lori, he brews in Warren.
Yep, he brews. I think it's through a home occupation permit, I
Yes.
believe. He's brewing
Yes.
at home. Okay. So, yeah, we could do a little legwork and see what is a comfortable size for a small facility. Or, you all could go to little wineries over the weekend and report back.
Homework.
Research.
I just have to say, like, because we work in the brewing industry in our business, and a 5-barrel system, which is, kind of a starter system, is already 3,000 square feet. I mean, and that's basically, you've got no room for any water treatment stuff that you need and anything else that you want to do. It's extremely small. If you want to also have a tasting room, I mean, basically a restaurant, bathrooms and everything else. I mean, 10,000 square feet seems reasonable. And Brian, I mean, we're probably one of the only towns in Oregon that doesn't have a brewery. I mean, but everybody else is doing it, and somehow they're doing it with this issues with smells all over Portland, all over everywhere.
Yeah.
Well,
So
they
it
don't
just
deal with
seems-
it because they're Portland.
Well, yes, but there's every other town.
It's
has
not the
got-
only place they're
I
doing.
mean, it just seems very limiting to be
Yeah.
having that straight up, just saying that.
I think the other piece that I'd want to keep in mind is that a lot of those facilities that are smaller that don't have other facilities are doing a lot of storage on site as well. They're aging, they're storing, they're maybe even bottling, a small amount.
Bottling, I don't see how you could do it with anything we're talking about size-wise here.
Right. Well, I do know that smaller breweries in Portland, they'll bring in people certain times of year if they're bottling a holiday ale or something like that. But they do need space to do that. That's not where they're storing and where they're serving food. So, I think from that standpoint, up to 10,000 does make sense to allow some flexibility with that.
So, and Brian, just for your information, almost every brewery does do some canning now because it's what you have to do. And they'll bring in a mobile canning line. Like there's companies that come in and, they'll can for them and then they leave and then they come back in a month and do it again. I mean, you need space for that. So,
If you guys want 10,000 square feet, I won't fuss anymore, but I want the reference back to odor because
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I'm having a turn there.
Okay.
It's a great idea. So we'll move it to 10,000 and add the odor reference.
Yeah, I've got a question about the rules on odors. So does this extend to our industrial area as well?
Yes.
This is everywhere in the city.
So, I mean, effectively, we were talking about that type of production being appropriate for industrial, but still from an odor perspective wouldn't be allowed in industrial. And also, I mean, I've been on plenty of plastic manufacturing facilities. I mean, you can smell your plastics facility well before you hit their fence line. So how are we going to negotiate what is truly like industrial activity in this odor.
Okay, so back to your question about light industrial and just in general. It's really, yeah, exactly. So this does apply to the whole city. So it's really a matter of the size of the facility and whether they have this retail component or not. As far as the odors, if it were an operation where there is proposed to be odor, because they have to respond to that in the planning process, then we would look to see what sort of scrubbers they're providing or how they're addressing that. And it would be included in the conditions of approval then that they need to incorporate a scrubber to get rid of any smells offsite.
I think Brian's concerns are very legitimate for the commercial district. I don't know if this is practically achievable with
Mhm.
real industrial activity.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's,
yeah,
but, I used to go to Portland Brewing quite frequently,
sure.
that before they closed.
Yeah.
And if you caught them on the wrong day, and they were doing certain processes there, odor was extraordinarily strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't be able to keep a commercial tenant, nor could anybody in the immediate vicinity of that, because no lawyer, no accountant, no bookkeeper,
Right,
no massage therapist, nobody's going to want to be near that.
right.
And
Yeah.
so it's incompatible.
Yeah.
With types of uses.
Mhm.
And so
And I believe that wasn't, I mean, that was generally in a kind of more of a or light industrial type
that's-
zoning
yeah,
district.
that was in a light industrial
Yeah.
district.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe even industrial, but
Like maybe, yeah.
yeah, but at least a light industrial. And that's the whole idea here is that if you want your canning line and you want to use a large amount, well, you probably don't be in a commercial zoning.
Correct.
You need to
Yeah.
be in a light industrial or industrial zoning.
And so why this came about is, I don't know, it was probably 3-4 years back that council made it a goal to want to add distilleries, microbreweries, et cetera, into the commercial and expanded commercial zone. And just due to workload and being the only planner on staff, I didn't get to it. And so it was something we wanted to incorporate into this process as we're doing a heavy lift for these rewrites. So that's kind of where it all came from. It was a council goal. And so hopefully at the 10,000 square feet, we could maybe attract, that might be interesting to someone to try to come here and locate.
So are we putting a percentage, you mentioned earlier, a percentage of that 10,000 would be,
Allocated to like a retail or a tasting area. So that is a question that's out on the table. Is that something that that the committee recommends that we look at?
Looking at that, it talks about if your odor can be smelled by the neighbors, basically.
Yep.
Then I can't make candy because the neighbors will be able to smell it. You know,
Well,
You're
Pat,
only-
our
we've got some restaurants here in town that we'll talk
Yeah,
about too.
yeah. And it's going to be, our enforcement is definitely complaint driven. So I'm quite certain if you're making candies that, your neighbors probably aren't going to have an issue with that.
Especially after you give them free samples.
Yeah. But point well
Good point.
taken.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Did we want to discuss the percentage if
Yeah.
we wanted to
Let's do that.
do that or not?
So if we were to set a percentage, which in theory, I think makes sense, but then I get concerned about operations, say like Bamford's, right? Which is all production, very little retail and eating area. Would we be at risk of precluding like that?
I guess I would recommend that you go low then, something like 10%, so that you don't just get a window, you don't get a roll up door where they're just selling like dock sales type of thing, but you get a meaningful, vibrant place where there might be some cafe tables that you can sit and have your whatever.
Yeah.
So I would recommend you
A
do have
lower-
it, but you have it low,
lower
10%.
percentage.
Lower.
It'd be too much.
10,000, that would be 3,000 square feet.
I'd like to see a little bit higher than 10, because if you got a 5,000 square foot facility, then take 5,000 square feet, 10% of that's 500.
Mhm.
And if you include the bathrooms as part of that square footage and the entry door, looking at 350 to 400 square feet of actual restaurant area on a 5,000 square foot operation. 15 or 20% would seem more reasonable to me.
I guess I'm thinking of like Grand Central Bakery, like they do a pretty good production behind and then a smaller retail component.
It's really not that important to me personally, as long as it doesn't create a problem for its neighbors.
Mhm.
And maybe the answer is maybe we want to leave it a little bit loose so that we can attract somebody, because we try to tell them how to run their business. As long as they're not creating problems for their neighbors, that's more likely to prevent them from doing it. They have their ideas of what they want to do. We try to tell them what to do. Just say, we'll go somewhere else.
You want to be no more than or no less than? Or
No less than 10% of the overall building square footage shall be dedicated to the retail component. Retail or
Minimal,
food
but
service.
all.
I think we're going way too deep on this. We're allowing equipment rentals in this area. We're allowing storage units with or without a caretaker. And then we're going to say if a brewery wants to come in, they have to have a certain amount of a retail space. It doesn't seem right. I mean, think about it. We can allow a storage area through this whole thing with no caretaker, and that's fine. But if a brewery wants to come in, they have to have certain square footage for a restaurant. That just seems a little odd to me.
just to kind of, in my opinion, storage is not a, that's, that you're going to attract people to come. I think a brewery or something like that, the community. So I don't know.
Storage is conditional. It's not outright.
Well, all I'm saying is that, it's tough enough for businesses to start. I mean, that area, the brewery might start as a brewery that's going to have a pop-up on Fridays or something until they get going. I mean, it just seems like we're putting a brewery would be great for our town. And I just think that to put too many fences in front right in the beginning might be difficult to get somebody to come in.
Paul, would you be okay if it just said it must have a retail component?
As it is written now.
And just leave it at that. That'd be okay with me.
Okay.
Okay with it.
Hearing no more on that.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, great. So that is our discussion about commercial and expanded commercial. I'm gonna scroll ahead to section parking. Oh, sorry.
What page are you on?
I jumped to 29 to pull up the parking table.
I did have a.
Before we leave page 11,
Okay, I'm going back to 11.
it says wireless communications facilities not to include antenna support structures subject to the provisions of chapter 17.93.
Mhm.
Now, the very last item in that same table is wireless communication facilities subject to the provisions of chapter 17.93.
Yeah, but duplicate.
I'm confused.
Not to include.
Page are you on again?
Oh,
11 and
I'm sorry.
12.
So one is permitted, the anything but the antenna is permitted outright, but when you want to put the antenna, you require a conditional use permit, is the difference there. So the top one is permitted outright, but doesn't include the big tall antenna. And if you want to do that part, then you get a conditional use permit.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
the difference there.
I had a question on page 13.
Okay.
So current deal is we've got, it says no, the very top of page 13, no commercial building shall exceed 50 feet in height. Mixed use building shall not exceed 60 feet in height. And then and then it has a clause about being near a residential zone. We had talked about potentially at a previous meeting splitting this out so that the new lands that we add wouldn't necessarily have as high of a limit because that's pretty darn high. Is that going to be addressed somewhere else, or is the resolution that you guys just feel that should all be the same height?
Well, we had talked about keeping the A1 height limits. We weren't proposing any changes for C and EC to height at that point. Oh, sorry. Beth has a comment.
We had also talked about the possibility of neighborhood commercial. In other words, if you're going to have small commercial within a neighborhood, that might have different height limits. So if we brought in a little bit of commercial and say it was in the middle of a neighborhood, you might need a different, either an overlay or a different zone for that. Think that may have been part of that discussion.
That was also part of it, but we talked about kind of like how the candle was about 35 feet tall, that building something potentially that could be as high as 60 feet in our community, be taking away that small town feel, which we have kind of is riddled through all of our documents, but then we have the actual height limits are going back to something that would be opposed to that. I don't know what everybody else feels, but
I don't know.
It's like 60 feet is kind of, now I know you have a problem that you can't go change things that already are because it opens the city
Mhm.
litigation.
And this,
But we were talking about potentially new land coming in might have a lower height. So at least we don't make the problem any worse.
I'm just thinking about applying the code. And so I do think it would almost need to fit under a different zoning category then, because otherwise to say these commercially zoned properties, this doesn't apply to, but these ones down here it does apply to, would just make it a little more difficult to apply as opposed to if they're under a different type of commercial zoning district.
And you could do something, couldn't you, like commercial zoning and whatever, and commercial zoning, and then, and just have a couple small changes.
Yeah, there would need to be some sort of a distinction.
Yeah, instead of saying this area, okay, not okay, within the same zoning. And that'd be fine by me. I don't know how everybody else.
I would like to hear from everyone else though, because
would
I don't
too.
know, that would be a lot. Potentially, I don't think we were considering creating a new zoning district per se,
We are gonna have-
as part of this process.
As part of this process, we're gonna add a sizable amount of commercial zoning. And what I'd like to not see is a bunch of 60-foot apartments. And of changing the feeling of our
Right.
community. Everybody else is on board. If everybody's not, then it's a group and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and especially considering where some of these new parcels, commercial development opportunities are going to be, they're going to be kind of like the gateways of our community. And to have, 60-foot buildings right there, I don't know how that integrates into the feel of the community. And then also having the 60-foot height on there, does that somehow incentivize like residential development rather than commercial development? Potentially, if we were really trying to drive commercial usage.
I will let them respond if you have an answer to that. But one thing I wanted to say really quickly is the 60-foot maximum height only applies to a mixed use building. So you would have, presumably you would have commercial on the bottom floor and then your residential above. The 50-foot height limit for a commercial building has been in the code for long time. Just a commercial building to be 50 feet
I think we changed that code. You guys changed the code.
in 2018. We made the change to 60 foot to mixed use buildings, but I believe the 50-foot limit has been here for quite some time.
The tallest building in Scappoose right now, commercial, including apartments, the Candle.
Gosh,
I think it is, and it's
I don't
35 feet.
think so. I think we have some houses that are even taller than that are like 2.5, 3. I'd have to go back and look, Brian, because that surprised me because that really was only 35, 37 feet in height.
Mind
It
you,
wasn't.
that it's set below the freeway, so that if it was on the other side of the freeway,
Mhm.
it looks small. It looks shorter than it is because it's set at an elevation below the freeway. But if it was on the other side of the freeway, it would look.
I mean, every residential district in the city allows for a single family house to be 35 feet tall.
I know.
So we're not
Usually they have a pitched roof, which doesn't give them that feeling.
that sense. Yeah.
That sense.
Yeah.
But you may have 25 or 20 feet of building, and then you have another 10, 15
Yeah.
of a pitched roof. So it doesn't really, it doesn't have that feeling
Right.
of that size. But anyhow, I'd like to hear what everybody else has to say.
Yeah.
Do we have a commercial building that's 50 feet?
I don't know if we do. I mean, handle itself. The silo.
Casey has a comment.
Casey. That actually, yeah. So some of that kind of came into play back when there was an individual citizen in the city who was pushing for the 60-foot height limit. That was one of that actually
Right.
was.
And yeah,
Yes.
and I would have no issue with excluding a hotel from the height restriction because that's a real need for the community. But I think everybody should kind of weigh in on this and either say, yeah, they're okay with it, or no, they're not. On from there.
So I guess the only piece I'd like to ask, because I don't implement this code, but if someone came in with a strictly multifamily, it would be the 50 feet height that would apply. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so commercial building is the building class or like the building department that it's a commercial occupancy? This,
It's the use. So like, for instance, a residential use would
Mhm.
be subject to, if it was mixed use, could go to the 60 feet. Let me go back here.
sorry,
So
I didn't mean to
hang
throw
on,
more
because we have a
questions.
separate, hang on, everyone. We have a separate section of dimensional requirements for
Oh, yes, you
multifamily
do.
buildings
I'm gonna scroll to that.
specifically. So I
My apologies.
misspoke. Let me talk into the microphone. I misspoke. This is what got added. 60 feet maximum height for a multifamily building is what got added in 2018. So that's what we would
Okay, yeah.
consider multifamily is.
And that's what you would look to have a different height for a multifamily building.
Yeah. Another option, which I'm just throwing out there, could be specific for
Mhm.
just depending on what everybody felt. Meaning that you could allow everybody, I think, so we want a hotel bad enough that we'll take whatever we can get. But we could even say, going forward, that we have X height limit for commercial, 100% commercial use. And then we have a different height limit for apartments, even if they have mixed use. Once you go into the apartment arena.
Well, it's already at 60 feet and we don't want to go higher and there's an issue reducing it.
No, I'm not talking about existing
Oh, you're talking about in this new area.
the new areas that we're expanding our UGB and our reserves into.
Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. And he's more versed than I am, but he did say a while back that dollars per square foot, residential or multifamily is much more valuable than commercial space. And if our goal is commercial space here, as we move southward in the city toward Portland, yes, you could see developers buying those and creating 60-foot apartment buildings, right as you enter Scappoose. And I don't think that's what we really, not only do we want, but we're trying to increase our commercial space here. So I'm with Brian that if we could make another zone, I would think that would be positive for the city. I'm not sure, Lori, how you would, facilitate it, but I do agree with what his thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to considering how this plays out by any means. It's just something we'll need to kind of think through and talk about how we might implement that. Because the area that we're considering for a rezone is already in the city limits. So, changing from R4 to either A1 or, let me look at something really quick too. Because A1 has a different. So for the A1 zone, if we were to go A1 instead of commercial, multifamily buildings have a 50-foot limit.
I still think even 50 feet is it's going to feel pretty darn tall. I understand we're stuck with some of it,
Yeah.
but I think if you saw a 50-foot building on the west side of the highway, people would be amazed at how big it looked.
Yeah.
Because handles 15 feet below grade on the highway is a guess. And So now if you're 15 feet above grade or even 10 feet or 5 feet above grade, that alone makes it feel much bigger. Then you tack on another 15 feet of height on top of that. It's just not going to have a small town feel, which is kind of what we were trying to maintain.
Well, what I would say about land you'd rezone, that's probably some of the best land to rezone for A1. And you have so little of it anywhere. And the fact that you just don't have much of it is part of what's driving the development in.
A1 is only like 8 acres, isn't it, or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, so like possibly we could maybe allow it in the A1 because that's going to be supposed to be apartments anyhow.
Mhm.
But back to what Paul was talking about, which I referencing what I talked about previously, is that apartments are worth more per square foot than commercial is. So when you do a 60-foot building, people generally aren't going to, in this kind of environment, are not going to want to be on the second or third floor of the buildings. That's why Lorelei Village behind us converted their second floor to apartments. They couldn't rent it to commercial in a viable way. What you're saying really, you're creating more apartment land. Effect, because A, apartments rent for more per square foot, and B, commercial people generally don't want to be on the first floor unless they're in a real office building, which I don't know if we're ready for that yet.
Well, perhaps this is something we should take up a little bit later in the project, once we have a better sense of how much commercial land we might be bringing in, because you wouldn't bring in, even if you expanded the UGB in 2024, you probably wouldn't bring that land into the city limits for some time and zone it so that there's a little bit more time to have a more deliberate discussion about that through this project. And
I would like to see it resolved in this project just because I'm afraid that if it doesn't get resolved, it won't. But I'm not opposed to tabling it for now and moving on, and we can go back to it at a later time.
Yeah, because there would be areas too that we would be considering rezoning or redesignating from industrial to commercial, which would have an effect sooner rather than later.
So on the rezoning areas that you're talking about, does the city wouldn't have any liability if they had a different height? They
What do you mean
well,
liability?
like you can't.
Oh, because they don't have current zoning.
Yeah.
I don't think
That's
so.
correct. I think-
They would remain with county zoning until they annexed in, so we wouldn't necessarily be changing anything currently.
So I mean, we theoretically could do it on that too. It just seems like, if developers are going to do whatever they're incentivized to do,
Sure.
and financially, apartments are going to make more sense than commercial and scaffolds, because there's an infinite demand,
Yes, there's a pent up need for sure.
infinite demand, and a much higher lease rate. So
Yeah.
that's what's going to get built if we incentivize it. And setting the heights, higher the heights, the more we're incentivizing, less we're incentivizing commercial. I've already determined for myself on a piece of land I own, I'd like to develop that it's not economically viable to build commercial right now with the high construction costs, unless I incorporated residential as part of it. The commercial becomes a loss leader. And basically, and it's just mixed use commercial just isn't what we lease it for versus what construction costs right now are. It's kind of a tough ride in Scappoose. Not saying it couldn't be done, but it's difficult. It would be a much easier thing to do apartments. So if we incentivize apartments, we're going to get apartments. That's
Paul,
That's what we've talked about.
Paul, did you have a comment?
Sorry, I forgot. No, I did not. Sorry.
I've been taking notes so I can summarize some.
Can you summarize that?
So what I've heard is that there's concern about the maximum height for mixed use in the existing commercial zones, and that land that's newly brought into the UGB or land that might be rezoned through this project, perhaps there could be a new commercial zone with a lower height limit for mixed use buildings.
I think multifamily. more than mixed
Multifamily,
use.
yeah.
well, commercial that becomes more.
Hmm.
It's the same thing.
It's an allowed use, yeah.
They're straight multifamily.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, for mixed use or multifamily buildings.
yeah, yeah.
But mixed use, you have the same concerns with height. If it has commercial on the first floor, the same concerns.
Put 5 floors. I don't believe at this point in our history, we're going to end up with, if it's a straight commercial building, unless it's a hotel, I don't think we have a real fear of somebody putting in a 5 or 6 story building. I just don't think there's enough demand to justify that. So it's not going to happen. So we don't need, I mean, maybe someday in the future, the city will have to be concerned about it. But right now, I don't think it's big enough of a concern. Right code around that.
Well, let's kind of talk through it on our end and see what we could maybe bring back to you and then move on for tonight if that's all right.
Sounds great.
Okay, so the next conversation is related to parking area standards. I'm going to advance to page 29 unless anyone wants to stay somewhere before that.
I think there was one other chapter with code revisions.
Oh, before we get there.
Yeah.
Revisions to-
24.
Yeah,
Page 24.
So the next section, which was EC, is the same as commercial. So we were skipping over that. And then on page 24 is the landscaping, screening, and fencing.
Yes.
Okay, so we're on 24.
So 24 just has the addition of a comma, nothing major there. So if we skip forward to 25. This is where we do talk about buffering screening requirements. Currently in your code, you're screening from different types of uses. But what staff indicated was that this gets tricky when there's, two uses that you wouldn't necessarily want to require the use on the site to screen and their neighbor to screen. You end up with a huge amount of buffer landscaping in between two uses that are generally compatible. And so one way to resolve that is to separate and require buffering and screening when you're next to a different zone. So if you're commercial and you're building next to residential, that makes sense that some screening would be necessary, but not necessarily between different types of uses. Thoughts on that?
We have one typo on here that we have zoning design instead of designation.
Thank you.
Where I see this sometimes is because currently it says, that this buffering is required between different uses is say like where Peak Performance just went into the old Sears building. Well, there's the old non-conforming residential homes just north of that. Now, mind you, those houses have been next to commercial for the last 50 plus years. But I still had to make them put in a little landscape buffer there and fence and everything, even though the houses are in a non-conforming commercial space. So that gets frustrating. It's harder for developers to meet that requirement. And so I thought, well, I think those houses are pretty well aware that they're next to commercial. And so maybe we just change this to make it different zones instead of different uses.
The only issue, I think it's great to help developers. The only issue I would have is the Old Town overlay. I would assume the Old Town overlay would be,
This does not apply to that.
okay, so that's completely different ballpark.
Right.
It sounds great.
Okay.
Forward to page 26. And here there is quite a bit of redlining, but really what that is doing is removing parking area landscaping and screening from this section of the code. So we want to move it forward to the parking area and off-street parking and loading section of the code and make it a more robust portion of that chapter. So the redlining here is just really removing anything related to the parking portion. Page 27. So in page 27 at the top, which is not showing up on your screen. There we go. We did look at revising the height of fences, and that's related to a building code change.
Right. So over 6 feet used to require a building permit. It no longer does. It's 7 feet or greater. So this is just a code cleanup.
Okay. And then related to fencing around ponds and pools, there is Oregon Residential Specialty Code. There are clear standards about how you fence a pool, whether you're in a private home or a multifamily or a commercial development. And so we wanted to just simplify and not have to keep the city's code section up to date with that and just instead reference the applicable standards. But for fish ponds and other decorative pools that are not considered swimming pools by ORS language, then we want to go ahead and keep those requirements and make sure they're clear. What we have for that section.
That
I-
section of this, I'm missing it. Is there a height Or any sort of like specification around the fencing listed there?
For the fish ponds or for the, yes, it is, at least it has to hold, oh, excuse me, a wire screen or cover. Oh, nope, that's not the, it has to have, a fence or a wire screen covering the pool, but it doesn't have a minimum height for the fence. It doesn't currently in your code.
I mean, you could put up a little
Yeah, a little 1 foot.
fence.
Well, because it does, yeah, it just says, has to be enclosed or covered by one or both. A fence completely surrounding the yard, blah, blah, blah. We could list a minimum fence height, although typically decorative ponds, want to, it's kind of on display, so people would want to see it. So it would be the perimeter of the yard more than likely, which typically would be a 6-foot fence. If they don't want it fenced, then they could do the wire screen or cover as the second option.
Paul, did you have a comment?
Yeah, going back a little bit, and Lori, these questions for you specifically. So if you look at kind of what's trending in Scappoose with the candle, very, very small apartments with little to no storage, the outside decks are being used as storage. And, with the candle, it's quite visible, from the highway. And the question is, would this quote unquote storage area and decks, what's your thinking on that?
So we don't, yeah. There is no provision in the multifamily related to multifamily buildings that govern what someone can store on a deck or patio. I mean, I understand where you're coming from and the concern of that. At the same time, I don't know to what extent the city would want to be involved in outlining requirements for that for multifamily. My thought is like, well, would we require them to have, some sort of storage lockers on site for people to store things in? Well, then that's driving up the cost of development. So I guess I'm interested in hearing what others think about that.
The issue of the owners of the apartments, that be.
That would be something that they would control in their rental agreement for sure, which is why I would tend to not want to tell them how they need to do that.
It's not an uncommon thing to see a minimum. I'm like, Newburgh jumps into my mind that they require a minimum, I believe, 60 square foot storage area, but it's generally like a closet space off that deck, or something like that. But it does require more space and drive up the cost and remove the usable space of the apartment. So it's definitely a trade-off.
And then even if you're requiring that, there's still no guarantee that you wouldn't
Right.
have that stuff out on the patio or deck.
I think,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think you don't want something that requires city code enforcement,
Mhm.
meaning like you can't put a bicycle on a deck or whatever. You can't have
That's
that
too hard
because you
to-
guys don't have you don't have the
No.
resources to deal with that. So I think the direction would probably be to create a minimum amount of storage. And then probably the way to come up with a number is look at other cities that have done it and then maybe pick an amount that's a little less than the norm so that it's not creating a burden. Just so that you can't give somebody a closet this big and say, go after it, Tiger. By the way, you can hang your clothesline on the deck.
Yeah. I'm interested in what Chair Kessie's opinion is.
I think if you make the developers do storage, they're still gonna store it on their deck.
I do too.
So
do
it's more of
too.
a management enforcement and what I've seen from property management companies, usually they say outdoor furniture, outdoor items can be on the deck, but not indoor items.
Okay.
That's how it's enforced by the property management company.
Okay.
So that's what I see.
Also, strong bicycle parking standards, which you do have.
We do
so,
have, yeah.
But people have to put their bike where they feel it's safe, I suppose.
Mhm.
That can be an issue too.
Let's go back to Kim's comment about the fence height.
We'd like to put in a minimum.
We want to do a minimum of 24 inches, or what were you thinking for a fence height for the
Yeah, I mean, I'm
ponds?
not an expert on fences, but if it's if the intent is safety in the code, I just want to make sure that what's in the code built in.
No, that's a good point. And I actually didn't catch that there wasn't one in there already. I was just cleaning up the language that was already there. But if you have a front yard fence, in most jurisdictions, I'm sorry, I don't know Scappoose is off the top of my head, but usually it's 36 inches for a front yard. Is that
It's 4 feet, I
oh,
believe.
48? You can go up to. Yeah, so maybe something in that range.
For a pond, that seems pretty excessive to me.
Is there
For a
state
pond.
code that cover this?
For swimming pools, yes, but not for the decorative type of fish ponds or things.
Actually have a decorative pond in one of my buildings. It hasn't been in use for years. The real solution is just you wire screen,
Correct. Yeah.
because then you put that screening a few inches below the surface
Yep.
of the water.
Yeah.
It's unnoticeable and there's no hazard. And you
Right.
get to look at your pond. What's the point of a pond if you got a fence around it? So, I mean, I think from a practical standpoint, you're going to end up with the right wire screening in the water because it's unnoticeable, it's safe, and it doesn't have a detrimental thing. So, I mean, you can give them an option of a fence if you want, but
And yeah,
I
and
would just go with the wire screening and call it good.
we do have both as an option. So, we could say 6 foot or 48-inch or whatever we want for the fence surrounding the yard where it's located.
And drive them to the screen.
And then they have,
Yeah,
well,
that's
and
what
then,
you
and then
want.
that's the other option.
Because it looks good
Yeah.
Any-
and it's cheap.
Jeff, did you have a comment on this particular subject? No, Casey, did you?
I don't want to get too far into your guys' business here, but I'm just thinking of those little water features when you walk up to somebody's front door. That
So it has to have.
that's a pond, I guess, and the depth. Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that part. Okay,
We
Right.
didn't read that part, but that's
Okay,
what it,
thanks.
yeah.
I was gonna say.
I would say if we are requiring a height, I have a koi pond myself that's deeper than 18 inches. And I don't have a fence around my yard, but I have a little 24-inch fence, little bitty fence that's woven into the vegetation, so you can't really see it, that protects the pond. So I don't think a 48-inch fence around a koi pond would be something we want to try to enforce on people. So I think we're going to require a height for a koi pond, then we should do it at a height that a little toddler can't get through a 24-inch fence, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
It still keeps the beauty of the pond and the intent of that.
Add 24 inches consensus. Okay. Do it. Okay. One final piece, and I'm just going to fast forward here to page 29 to the table with the parking standards. So we were looking at how other jurisdictions handle parking lot landscaping. These were the jurisdictions, Beaverton, Hillsborough, and Tigard were provided by the city engineer who has done a lot of commercial and industrial site development and is really familiar with parking area landscaping standards. Milwaukee is one that I was recently looking at, so it seemed to be pretty applicable as well. So right now, to build a parking lot, you have to have approximately a 4-foot perimeter buffer around it in Scappoose. But then as far as needing to, if you're adjacent to the street, but adjacent to other properties or inside the parking area, there's really no specifications about how to do that or if you should do that. These jurisdictions generally do have those same standards as far as separating the parking area from right of way, and then separating a property from another property, and then what the interior should be. There are benefits to requiring interior parking area landscaping, reducing heat island effects, beautifying the site. There are costs associated with that to the development of the property. A lot of times now we're seeing stormwater treatment occurring in some of these facilities. That's good and bad. It can have impacts on pedestrian walkability through the parking areas. So there's there's pros and cons to doing this, but we wanted to get your take on whether we should do it, and if we do it, what size it should be. And so we'd like to open discussion about that.
What do you mean by stormwater issues?
Oh, yes. So, when you are building a piece of property and you need to address your stormwater, and sometimes you'll build a swale on your site where the water can gather. We are seeing that in some jurisdictions where in the parking area, you might integrate that into the landscaping that's in the parking area. So you're getting kind of double bang for your buck. You're getting that area landscape, but it's also accommodating some of that water.
The page 30, is that a visual of what?
Oh, yes, thank you. So in Tiger, they provide visuals in their code. So we went ahead and provided them, although they didn't print all that well. But the first image is related to adjacent to the sidewalk or the street, the public right of way. In Tiger, they require 8 feet to separate the parking area from the sidewalk, and then a fence or a hedge that's 3 feet in height. So you're blocking the headlights as well from shining off into the adjacent street. And then when you're adjacent to another property that's residential, they're requiring a 6-foot fence or wall to again block that headlight and potentially some noise and other view type things, and have a minimum 5-foot depth landscaping area to separate those areas. And then on the final, which is the least well printed, but it does give you an idea of what it looks like on the interior for their standards. They have a 5-foot minimum width along the building. They have, you can do your landscaping within the different parking rows, or you can, that 5-foot is the cumulative of the middle. I'm gonna use my pointer here. These middle 3 landscape islands are the equivalent of this 5-foot long landscape island. So you could do it here and not do it within the parking area in this example. And then here, these are double length because they're double fronted parking stalls. Here, they're only a single length because they're single parking stalls. So this is, I guess, an illustrative description of what Tigard requires for their interior parking. Thoughts on that? Preference to add this to the code or not?
I have a couple of thoughts. I think it's going to reduce parking availability with all these little blobs of greenery. Currently, we do have requirements. I mean, we do perimeter landscaping for the general most part here. So the perimeter's covered. I have especially a problem with having on the rear of the building, because then how do you put rear entrances?
Mhm.
And I generally try to keep vegetation, direct vegetation off buildings, because it leads to rot, because you have to irrigate that. So when you're irrigating, you're applying water right next to your structure. Generally, you want to try to keep water away from your structure. So definitely not on the rear of the building, but even everywhere else, you're going to have to probably run irrigation lines to these various little spots. It's going to increase cost. I think it's much better to leave it at the perimeter. The city's trying to go more towards not irrigation of green spaces because of water issues, and having these islands that are going to be required to be irrigated, no matter what you put in there. Much, I mean, I guess you could put some grasses in there or something, but for the most part, you surround it with asphalt, you're going to have to irrigate it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is to get some shade in the parking lots and to try and, provide some cooling.
If I can just comment about the parking next to the building, I agree with what you're saying. You could imagine this could have parking on this side as well. So this is just illustrative of running the landscaping perpendicular to the spaces. It's not at all mandated that you landscape against the building in
Is
this.
the current landscaping requirement 10% of the parking lot area? I believe that's what we have.
No, in fact, it's so there, Ryan. I gotta look it up really quick. There's a requirement for parking along the perimeter, and it's like what is it, 4
For
square?
every linear foot.
Yeah,
Mhm.
4 square feet for every linear foot.
Okay.
Downtown, I'll look real quick while you guys are chatting. We don't have like where you have to have so much
I thought we had a 10%.
interior to the
Okay.
lot.
Okay.
It's all to the perimeter.
Mm.
And then our cottage cluster code, we do require, I think it's like every 5 stalls that there's landscaping in
Mhm.
between. Um, I think it might be in the downtown overlay.
Maybe, that downtown is what I know mostly.
You guys like, think of it just having the ones that are outside that face the border, those shaded and then not having all of the park.
That's what the current code does require.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's just on the outside.
The current code does not require it to be continuous. It just requires 4 square feet per 1 linear foot.
You can put it in a
So
big area. and
You
then
could, yeah.
what you probably would do is use your bioswales and dual purpose them, because you got to get rid of your stormwater if you're not in a storm.
Yeah.
And so then you frequently will do that.
So it is in the downtown overlay code. It just says landscaping around and within surface parking areas shall equal 10% of the total parking area. So it's not specific necessarily about where it needs to be located within the lot, just that it's 10%.
Could do it all in the perimeter.
And that's what I see.
Yeah.
Correct. So there's always some landscaping required, but pretty much they're meeting that landscaping requirement with their parking perimeter requirement.
Another alternative, if you wanted, would be to, on very large projects, something with 120 parking spaces or more, or something like that, to have it wired on the interior where you really do end up with an asphalt island.
So having a trigger point of over a certain number of stalls required, then
What I'm concerned about is you got a lot of smaller lots in this
I
town,
agree.
especially in Old Town, but not even skipping Old Town. There's a
Yep.
lot of smaller lots here.
Yes.
And parking is always a problem, meeting your parking requirements. And if we gobble it up with lots of little blobs of greenery, I mean, it's fine to have greenery, but let the guy doing it decide, how can I fit whatever the number is, 10% or
Yeah.
whatever, into their plan so that it works for them, instead of
Yeah.
forcing them to put it in specific spots so that they suddenly have their hands tied and maybe suddenly they've lost a few parking spaces and now something doesn't work that they thought would work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point about well, obviously I know it's going to drive up cost, or you're going to have fewer parking stalls available, which means you're going to have a smaller building, basically. Landscape or irrigation, you're right, is an issue, getting it to where it needs to be. If it's in the center of the parking lot, I guess what I would suggest, number one, is we would want that 4 foot, our current code says 4 foot landscape perimeter minimum width. That's not very adequate for like any kind of a tree that might be planted there. So we definitely would want that bumped up to 5 feet. And then maybe looking at code that then applies to the interior of the lot if it's over a certain number of stalls.
We thought of doing something like where there's a tree, it must be this wide or
There's a canopy coverage requirement. But I think we would look to tune that up too.
I just would hate to see making commercial harder to do, since commercial is
Yeah,
a hard nut already, given the
Yeah.
construction costs.
that's fair.
I agree with Brian on that. And also the 5 feet versus 4 feet. Every every foot matters, especially with parking and trying to make it as efficient as possible so you can get as many parking spaces as possible so the building can be feasible. And so I actually think the current what you have right now works well.
I'll agree with Chair Cassie. If you wanted to fine tune it a little bit, that's fine, but I think you kind of need to leave it to the developer so that he can make it work.
Smaller spaces especially because they're even tougher for a tenant to make work
Mhm.
in our city. But the bigger spaces like Fred Meyer, we may want a requirement of having more landscaping throughout.
So with the 4 foot requirement currently in Scappoose, it's 4 square feet per linear foot along the right of way. So you really could do it in blobs and not do the entire length of the right of way. Would you want to fine tune it to where you do get at least along the sidewalk, you're getting some greenery spacing between you and the park, like the pedestrians and the parked spaces? That would be one way to fine tune it, and it'd be keeping the standard basically what it is. And then, I mean, I think adding in your downtown, because downtown is where your smaller lots are too. And so it's probably already applicable, but just to cover anything that's not, having that 10% makes sense to me as well. And in whatever configuration to allow for flexibility.
Vacation and at the same time safety for pedestrians. That where you're suggesting.
I mean, yes, although you already require wheel stops or curbs to keep the cars from joining into the pedestrian sphere there. So, but yes, you do add more space between the vehicle and the pedestrian on the sidewalk when you increase that buffer or require that buffer for the entire length.
We switched from rear parking lots to front sidewalks?
Any parking lots. This is all parking
Okay.
lots.
Okay, so, okay.
Any parking
Mhm.
lots. Yeah. So I guess what is that consensus that we don't want to add in any specific requirements for how much landscaping in the interior of your parking area or the width of the landscaping strip or that sort of thing, but that we do want to see parking along the perimeter and then we're okay with the 10% total parking area to be landscaped at the developer's discretion.
Yeah, and I would exclude the rear of the building.
So
Also,
it's not that illustration is not indicative of a standard to do
okay,
that.
often you would want a sidewalk there, or you'd want
Yes.
entrances there.
Right,
For a
exactly.
variety of
Good
things, it would
point.
all be
Yeah.
detrimental.
Was Jeff some?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe would like to suggest we look at a minimum
yes.
size, you know, I
Mhm.
don't know if 120, I really am not good at estimating size, but like the lot at Fultanos, you know, like that's a big piece of asphalt. And yes, I know it gets used and packed, but I would say maybe anything larger than that, we might want to consider some interior canopy cover. You know, like we did have the tree study, we're short on canopy cover, you know, asphalt does heat things up a lot. No.
Yeah, there I can say I have not come across something like that in another city. So if there was local examples like that that we could look at and base it on the local um, situation here, because I don't know of any jurisdictions we could look to for code option, you know, for comparisons here. But if did you get that full pano?
Yeah, I got it.
You
Okay.
guys think that's a good proxy for kind of a larger?
Well, I mean, yes and no, because like, okay, so we want a Fultanos here. If we push up the cost, there's just so much they're going to bear, then they're just not going to. And so this is a small issue. I do believe that one of the best ways to make a commercial building look good, landscaping, that by adding landscaping, you can make things that aren't that nice look nice. So there's a value to the developer. Have it, but I'm just concerned about losing parking. And there's this whole game, and Pat was kind of talking about it a little bit, where you're trying to, you got your building and you got your parking lot, and you got to make the two pieces match so that the parking lot is sufficient to make the building work, make the whole thing economically viable. They like not to tie the hands of developers too much, because I think we're going to end up with less development, less options. People who live here want more restaurants and more things. So I don't know the perfect answer. I was just kind of doing some rough calculations. So a lot of commercial uses have a requirement of one parking space per 400 square feet of building, to be an idea. In Scappoose. Restaurants are much higher. They're 1 per 120. In reality, you probably need more than that. That's a minimum code. So if you used 100 parking spaces, that's going to be you're really kind of going after the Bi-Marts and the Fred Meyers of the world. 120. Somebody wanted to include that in something of those where that's really where you're going to have your big, you know, heat island with the huge parking lot. That's not going to affect the small guys. It's not going to affect medium-sized apartment buildings either. It's going to really kind of go after just the biggest of the big. I don't have an issue with that because at that level, it's the value to the community is reduced. They'll have deeper pockets to be able to afford it. But what I wouldn't want to see is that new Fultanas want to come here and they got a lot, they pencil it out and they're 5 parking spaces short. And so I still think of Fultanos as small business.
It's
I
kind of
don't
size of
think
a
of
brewery too. A brewery would be like a Fultanos.
And so like 10,000 square foot building. Is that's going to be like 80 square. It's going to be like, they could probably split out their production and so they wouldn't have as much of a parking requirement. So like a 10,000 square foot building might have something, depending on the mix of sitting restaurant versus production, might have something like 60 parking spaces required. Be an idea size. we wouldn't want to do that to a small brew pub. Wouldn't want to do that, but we might want to be happy to do it to a new Fred Meyer or that size.
Starting point.
Steer back.
Mayor Joe, like going off of Kim, we did have a canopy study and we were really low compared to a lot of cities around. And so I think the council has had the idea to look into that a little bit more. And I think we do want to increase this. And I don't know if you're able to do anything on just tree coverage canopy. You look down there at Fultano's and Les Schwab and all those, there's no trees at all. It's all concrete. The fitness center here across the street over here has 4 trees for their 6 or 7 spots. It's not taking up any parking because you can park under them and it's just right along the sidewalk. So I know this may not do with landscaping, but I would really like to see trees brought in some way.
Well, you could add verbiage that there'll be trees in the parking lot landscaping. Outside of Old Town, the Old Town, you require trees, landscaping. But in the regular commercial zone, don't you require trees in?
In that perimeter, we do.
Yeah,
In the
so they should
perimeter.
have trees.
Correct. And yeah, so it's
Oh.
really this is about internal to the parking
Mhm.
lot.
So we already require trees.
So if we were to look at a percentage canopy cover over those spaces, it might be that they're using the perimeter and then something near the building and something on the other side to get to a minimum percentage of canopy cover.
We also want to try to keep trees away from buildings because they do bad things to buildings. So be concerned about crowding buildings. You know, if we want things like awnings, we want things
Mhm.
that like that, they are severely affected by trees.
Is the tree requirement recent?
Mm-mm.
Well, because Joe said there's no trees at all down around Fred Meyer and all those businesses.
Yeah, no, it's just required really adjacent to a public street. And so a lot of times just the street trees themselves will meet the requirement. And then some shrubbery between the trees.
You could accept not adjacent to buildings.
It sounds like we need to work on this one a little more.
We can have more
Yeah.
discussion about it.
Clarify, so this, the ones on page 30, those 2 draft ones on top,
Yeah.
is that what you're, seeing on the
We-
outside exterior?
But the 8 foot would be 4 feet and there wouldn't be a minimum fence or hedge unless that was something you wanted to see.
If it's adjacent to a residential, it does require a 4-foot fence
Okay.
on the perimeter. If it's adjacent to a street, it doesn't require, like here, this is the picture on the top's adjacent to a street and it requires the 3-foot minimum height fence in addition to the buffer space.
That's what we're proposing. I think especially if it's facing like the highway, I think.
We hadn't even discussed requiring the fence yet. We were just talking about the width of that buffer area for now and what the interior requirement might be.
Okay.
To have, yeah.
Block out the light
Mhm.
Along the highway.
along the highway.
Mhm.
Along
Maybe
any
the
street.
arterial? Or would you think the same if it's a lower classification of street, or is it specific to the highway that you want to
I'm
see
just
that?
saying more traffic.
Uh-huh.
I'm just thinking that it's distracting
Uh-huh.
for drivers that are driving.
And I think most businesses use the hedges to accomplish this rather than a fence.
Mhm.
It's very common. You see along a perimeter of a parking area, a hedgerow that's 3 feet in height.
I
Yeah.
prefer a hedge.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So other thoughts on that preference to add the fence, 3-foot fence in, hedge or fence along right of way?
The idea of or.
Or, yes, or. Okay, and we already have a standard for along residential property. So that's the second one is a 6 foot along residential, but we have a
We add
4.
berm. 3-foot fence, hedge, or berm.
Or berm, yeah.
I think that's a good idea.
Berm would give people some options and it
Mhm.
would also be easier for landscaping. a berm that could still be mowed.
Well,
Mhm.
and if your site was below grade of the highway, you wouldn't have to then put a fence on top of what you're already coming down.
Mhm.
It'd be considered a berm.
Okay, and then was there a sense of being okay with increasing to a 5 foot perimeter landscaping width or keeping it at 4?
I'd like to see, if we change anything, it would be percentage, not giving exact measurement. And every piece of land is different. My idea that there's no magical land fairy that's going to give us that extra 2 feet we need for our 18-foot minimum depth parking space. We might have space somewhere else where we could put it. So if you're going to change the requirement for landscaping, I would do it in square feet, not in specific.
So what if we were to just apply the parking lot landscaping language that's in the downtown overlay to everywhere? So landscaping around and within surface parking areas shall equal 10% of the total parking area. I mean, that's just they can kind of play around with that where it makes sense.
Have you any idea? How much does that change the current?
I don't know.
I say it would also depend really on the shape of
It would. It
on
would.
the parking lot.
Yeah.
I don't have an issue with that personally, but probably here's more.
And I'd still want the perimeter parking requirement and so that could meet, some of this as well, but maybe if they're not meeting it, then they do a little additional somewhere on site.
I like the idea of percentage a lot
Yeah,
because every property
gives you flexibility,
flexibility and we accomplish what we need
right?
And
city too.
in addition to a tree canopy percentage also, so that we're making sure we get that.
I have a problem with canopies. Tree counts are much easier to accomplish than canopies.
Canopy coverage is not
Canopies are
straightforward.
hell.
Mhm.
The problem with the canopy requirement is what it's incentivizing you to do to put is put a giant maple tree someplace that it doesn't belong. And so you have people put in trees and they're tiny and they're cute and they look nice. They get a little bigger, they still look nice. Then they become a god awful mess when they get too big. That met that requirement, so they got their plans approved. It creates a problem down the road because that tree doesn't want to be on a little piece of land.
Mhm.
It wants a lot of land. And it just seems like if you're going to increase trees, then I would prefer a count, not a canopy.
Well, you'd
We a
have to
tree
limit,
list. We have approved tree
Mhm.
list.
but that's just for street trees. That's not for internal to the lot.
I would like to avoid canopy if possible. If we have to have, if we're going to have more trees, then I would say
Well, here's a suggestion because like in Tiger, they require 90 square feet per island. In Hillsborough, 95 square feet per island, 1 tree per island. Maybe it's something like 1 tree for every 100 square feet of parking, landscaping area. Just a straight standard, and then they can
you
place
can
it
put it where you want.
Mhm.
It's one tree and it's not a canopy.
1 tree per 100 square feet of landscaping, and then it's
People
easy
with
to
yards.
review it.
You okay with the 1 per 100 square feet? That's a lot of trees, because if you think about it, I mean, a tree, that's going to be continuous trees.
Well, remember, it's only 10% of of your parking area that's landscaped. So if you're
the parking area.
of the landscaped area, 1 tree for every 100 square feet of landscape area, not of parking area.
So 100 square feet is 10 by 10.
Mhm.
I would like to see it at 1 per 150. That would be much easier to work with. Development standpoint. Again, you have more experience in this. 150.
That achieve.
I mean, it's moving in the right direction. If there's, it sounds like there's concern about increasing the cost of development by having this, provision added. So I think it's a compromise to get towards our goal.
And it's a recommendation that you'd be making moving forward, and then
Correct.
council would have the ability to make a different decision.
Mhm.
There are instances where there might be less than 150 square feet of landscapable area for a small business.
I doubt it. We could always write a minimum one
Yeah.
tree. You know, we can
Minimum,
make sure. Yeah,
There's that
the
instance.
minimum
Yeah.
of one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure.
I'll give you your tree.
Bonsai.
Gotta be a honey crisp apple.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Do we then, I feel like we kind of got to a good spot. Do we want to consider larger parking lots too, or do we feel like?
Was there sense to require interior landscaping for lots of, say,
But it was bigger than.
Over 100.
over 100 stalls? Then we have kind of a different code that they have to, meet that requires additional. How many stalls they have, I'd have to look, but it's probably over, yeah, it's probably,
300 probably.
I was gonna say over 200, yeah.
So the suggestion made by Brian was 100 or 120 space parking lots might be a good threshold for requiring interior landscaping and trees. And Kim, right after that, you agreed that that was a good starting point for the discussion.
Weimar's the park.
I don't know. Do you have any idea? how
Weimar would be
I'm
closer to
thinking Weimar
100.
Probably has somewhere 120.
I can check, but I would say as far as what we can all visualize, that would be a development size then this would apply to.
Mhm.
So I can check and see from their land use approval how many stalls they have and then, so perhaps what we need to do then is sort of reflect this in some code language and then bring it back to you all to look at again once we've sort of worked through that. Okay.
Casey.
Does that include industrial?
Yes, this is applicable in any parking lots in the city, and then separate would be the downtown.
Okay, I just really think hard about industrial. I've personally been part of some projects that almost were lost because of parking requirements in a industrial zone that they're very much not in the, they use that property in a much different way. So interior vegetation could cause really big problems with industrial operations.
That's a really good point. My experience with industrial is that the required parking area is typically pretty small, but like then the loading and storage areas are kind of bigger.
Not necessarily a manufacturing facility that has 100 and some employees.
Would need more.
Parking's prime, but they store material on site. They move material around a lot. And that parking real estate, it's can pose some problems. And then the types of folks that are in the business of industrial operations can be a little quirky, and the landscape requirements other than something at the street. And I've seen can be enough to literally lose a project and say, the hell with this, and move to a different location or consider a different location. So just for industrial, I think that's something to really look at.
Maybe we should just exclude industrial from the interior parking. Give them the 10% like we're talking about for everybody else, but don't give them a pass on the interior parking. There's only going to be, they're not going to be, unless it's a really big development, they're not going to have more than 100 or 120 spaces anyhow. So if they're real big, they're going to have, they have a lot of employees, then what he's saying would be pertinent. And I do agree that there'd be people that would say, your parking, go elsewhere. So maybe we want to do that. I don't know what everybody else thinks.
If I can just comment too, though, the elsewhere is not a large concern for me. Having researched a lot of the other communities, there's not a distinction for industrial parking areas. So anywhere in Oregon, I would think cities in Oregon, you're going to have a requirement for parking area landscaping. There's
I'm
not a
saying
lot of
not
cities that
no
don't.
requirement.
Yeah,
I'm saying
interior.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they do generally have interior.
I mean, doing the research for this, I didn't find any comparables that didn't have it. Yeah.
St. Helens, I mean, just Pacific Stainless Products. If you go to that and see how they use that site and how they're just flooded trying to find spots to park for their employees, could cause serious issues to do interior. And that was a specific project that literally almost came down to maybe we'll go to Kalama instead. And whether that's silly or not, it was a real thing.
So thoughts on excluding industrial from other members?
50-50 on it myself.
We can talk about it when we bring back
Mhm.
we'll have more discussion on
We'll
whether we
think through it,
include
yeah, bring back
industrial.
something proposed for your consideration.
Right. Let's pause there on development code and give Beth just a tiny bit of time to talk about the comp plan.
We have 35 minutes left too.
It's all fine. We will get out on time. And I'm going to propose that we try to get out a minute or two early. So I'm going to bring up things on my screen. Okay. Give me a little moment to shake my head out a little, because that was a lot of zoning. Okay, so we're switching to comprehensive plan, and the purpose of your comprehensive plan is to essentially it's what guides your land use planning. In a certain sense, we've been talking about this a little bit backwards, where we've been talking a lot about zoning and then about comprehensive plan. It's okay. Zoning, comprehensive plan policies, they're iterative. So your comprehensive plan is supposed to set out what kind of uses do you have in your community and what are some of the goals and the policies around those uses. This is high level stuff. This is not what action should we take in the next couple of years to implement this. This is not how many trees should we have per parking lot. It's not any of that. So it's much higher level than that.
What page are you on?
I'm not on any page yet.
Okay.
I'm on blah, blah, blahing.
36.
Okay. And Heather will go grab
Here
pages.
we're on 36. I don't know what Beth's talking about.
Okay. So what we've done is we've gone through the existing comprehensive plan policies and let me step back another moment. Your comprehensive plan, it's really big and it's really full of stuff and a lot of the stuff is old. And so in my little happy place for comprehensive planning, your comprehensive plan is a little short, maybe it's 20 or 30 pages of policies and goals about how you want your community to grow over the next 20 years, over a longer period of time. And then you've got your things like your housing needs analysis or your transportation system plan attached to it. And those things can be repealed easily because they're not integrated into the comprehensive plan. So when you do your next housing needs analysis, you just, you repeal the old one and you replace it with the new one. So you've got a new fact base. And your comprehensive policies and goals should really be reflecting what's in your fact base. So there's Lori and I have had a lot of discussions about taking some of the information that's scattered in different places out of your comprehensive plan and adopting it as appendices to your comprehensive plan. So we're trying to strip some of the fact base out because every time you go through and you update your comprehensive plan, you have to update a lot of information in your existing comprehensive plan. And I know because I did this back in, was it 2016? And I probably complained to Laurie back then about this. So there's, 3 or 4 different places where you can get information that is, old or different. And you don't want that in your comp plan. You want clarity. So that's what we're trying to go for here. Here we've only given you in my lovely memorandum, we've only given you the parts of the comp plan that are our policies and goals. There's other parts of it that we're working on streamlining and repealing parts of it. So there'll be a lot more red lines in your comp plan. And it's not that we want you to have less information. It's that we want you to have the information you need in a predictable place. That make sense? Okay. All right. So my plan is just to step through this section by section in the memorandum. So here we are on page 37, talking about general principles for land use. So this is like the highest level of the high level stuff. And I wasn't planning on talking through each and every one of these changes. I'm hoping as we walk through this, you guys will stop me if you see something, maybe we've got an old policy that you don't like, or maybe there's a policy that we've, taken out a piece of it, or a new policy, the red lines. That's what I'm hoping we'll focus on. So in things like policy number 7, I think these are policies. Yeah, these are goals. Goal number 7, we edited that so it would be a little more concise. Taking out, the positive contribution to quality of life and personal satisfaction of residents. I don't know what the city has to do directly with making sure your residents are satisfied. So trying to make it focused more on things that the city has direct control of, and getting a little bit more modern phrases in here. So in this section, which I'll scroll down for some more, were there any comments on the edits or anything we didn't edit in this section?
Pages 37 and 38.
Thank you. 37, 38.
Completely new.
3 is completely new. So
That's reflected from the vision statement.
is reflected from the vision statement. Thank you. It's like I looked in the vision statement and said, what did we say? And tried to make sure there was good, quality of life sort of information in here, because that makes sense.
Mayor Joe?
Just real quickly on number 18, local newspaper and radio station. I mean, can we put in social media as well? We use a lot of our website for updating people on land use and various things.
See any reason not to add social media?
Kim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, on striking 16, natural and man-made resources of the community should be effectively utilized.
Huh?
Their reasoning for that, or just need a better language on that?
Well, I mean,
Think we weren't quite sure what that was referring to. I was thinking it could mean the gravel that we previously had here as a natural resource, which is, inside city limits at least. They're reclaiming all the gravel mines. So the other thing I was thinking that was made here was like the sauerkraut, which is no longer made here. So I was feeling like that's what that was referring to, and I didn't know if that was something that's really reflective of.
I would ask the question, is there a policy tied to it?
Yeah.
So is anybody going to be ineffectively using those resources?
Natural resources potentially when we get to industrial. All right, I read this last week. So there is
That's fair.
a section that relates to industrial, right?
There is a section that relates to industrial, and it may well be that we want like a specific policy there about some resource that maybe I haven't thought about it, and that's fine.
So I guess then how do these interrelate? Like, is these initial
These are some of the
goals overarching, and then the other
Very overarching
So
to this more of a specific use, whereas this is an overarching for all land uses.
I would maybe I mean I can't think of man-made resources really either, but maybe I would still appreciate inclusion of wise use of
Yeah, and then their wise use of natural resources. Okay.
and it's not like I object. I just
No, yeah, this is open for discussion.
The one that comes to mind when you say that is water.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, that seems like we're going anyhow.
that's an interesting one, yeah.
So just strike and man-made, and we could leave the natural resources of the community should be effectively utilized. That's fair.
It also would say that somebody comes here and they want to put a bottled water plant. They take the city water, they filter it, and then they water.
Mhm.
That would give.
exactly what I would
Was it?
like a Nestle comes, yeah, because
There's been a lot of articles that
issues
they'll use
yeah.
like 10 gallons of water to make this.
I mean we know our water is so good and special, but
One thing I'm
Probably.
thinking of too is heavy industrial, because we're talking about zoning a lot of industrial land, but city has a problem sourcing water.
And heavy industrial, there's no land zoned for it at this point. It's all light industrial. So So, but I mean, we could, you know, mention specifically, especially water. I don't think there's any problem with that.
No.
Any, and we can always come back to these. I'm going to push you a little bit hard, and we can always come back. Or you can always send your comments to Laurie. So any other comments on this, you know, broad set of goals? All right. Eric Hesse's like, get going. All right, we're gonna dive into housing. So, and what we've got here is a goal for housing and some policies for housing. And then there's specific sections about each different plan designation. So suburban, residential, et cetera, et cetera. So are there comments on the goals? We changed number 1 a lot, in part to comply with what's in your housing needs analysis, so it matches that. And then also in part to comply with current Oregon law. So we named a lot more housing types.
Roll through this. So it doesn't pertain to anything, any of the text in here, but my question's more around like, how are we going to, how does this set to the direction for achieving this? So for example, number 3 talks about provide opportunities for development of adequate number of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels. Does that mean then?
That goes to your housing needs analysis. So in your housing needs analysis, the analysis was intended to do this. So you've got different housing types that are required, that are assumed to develop. You've got different zoning areas and different amounts of land that are zoned for those. So let's just take apartments for a moment. We know that you don't have enough land zoned for apartments, especially in A1. And our earlier discussion about what's happening in C and EC. And so the way this comes up is that we know you need more land for multifamily housing. A lot of that's going to be in your A1 zone. Some of it's in your A4 zone at lower densities than your A1. And so in looking at UGB expansion or land use efficiency measures, part of what we're doing there is making sure that you've got sufficient land for that.
So that's the providing the opportunity, basically.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I guess
Yeah.
we've had the discussion, we're not sure if that's all gonna yield truly affordable housing. Right?
Well,
So I
it
guess my
won't on
question-
its own yield truly affordable housing. You know, let's be honest. But I think it provides a place that if the city council chose to have a policy discussion about truly affordable housing and what is the city willing and able to do to support that, this comp plan policy in no way contradicts that.
I guess that's
Yeah.
ultimately my question is, does fusion of that type of aspiration, like, is that gonna drive a policy discussion necessarily, or just allows for a policy?
It supports that, yeah, in the future, should that become something that the council wants to take up, you know, waiver for SDCs or you know, some sort of tax abatement type program.
I think that's down in the policies, that
Yeah.
specific item.
And so that, yeah.
But you're not required to have those. But some smaller cities certainly are doing those things. I've got lots of examples of that.
I've got a question about last sentence of number 1
Mm-hmm.
and why those specific groups were broken out.
Yes, those specific groups are included in the needed housing statute. So it talks about housing for ag workers. Some of the other housing statutes talk about people with disabilities, seniors, college students. Those are all things that are applicable in SCAPUS. So you do have, you know, with PCC, you do have some college students. I think that there's a little bit of wording, yeah, maybe occupied by any resident in SCAPUS. So it was people that are more likely to have a little more difficulty finding housing. We could, you know, call it seniors, people over 65. Sure.
You know, you talk about 55 and older housing. Yeah, I don't know if you want to go to that low, but they want 55 and older.
I think if we just leave it at seniors, then there's room, if you want to develop any specific policies around that. And we don't have to specify, an age specifically. So we can call them seniors. Other comments here on these goals? Okay, and then on the policies for housing, let me just see. We've updated a little bit of, some of the language around, develop partnerships, that kind of thing. Yeah,
Define household with special needs. Are we talking about like households with varying abilities or accessibility needs?
we could define that, more specifically. So we could talk about disabilities, such as disabilities,
Just varying abilities and
Sure.
varying accessibility needs.
Number 3. Way this looks in the track changes is like a trash sentence, but it reads much better when you don't have the strike throughs with it. So then developing partnerships with agencies and organizations that support preservation and rehabilitation of existing housing. So that's something that I think will be starting to become a little more common in Oregon, at least I'm hoping so, as Oregon begins to grow its nonprofit capacity around some of that. And when you talk about affordable housing, preserving your affordable housing is one of the better bangs for your bucks. So, and this is, these partnerships can look a lot of different ways. It's not, saying the city is going to put up X number of dollars. The city might write a grant, for instance, to a state fund for preservation, and that might be part of the city's partnership, because cities will be able to access certain funds that others won't be able to access. So then we were just cleaning up a little bit around the manufactured home park, that manufactured home parks and subdivisions. The subdivisions is just a little bit redundant given today's language. And then the last item that we added on is essentially comply with federal fair housing law. You'd want to anyway.
Are we gonna call out the ordinance?
What ordinance? Yeah, the Fair Housing Act. Do you need any ordinance called out?
No,
No, this is,
it's not an ordinance per se. It's the federal policy.
maybe we should just
The other ordinance references are ordinances we adopted locally at the city, whereas this is a federal policy. Yeah, that's
just
the only difference.
add the word in Federal Fair Housing Act.
Federal, yeah.
Yes, I think that would be less confusing. Jeff, did you have a comment?
No, I just was gonna mention that it's a federal.
Yeah. Okay, then on to general residential. So this area, just to remind us all, is centrally located. It's where community services are convenient. Let me zoom down to the map. We've updated all of the maps of all of this based on the buildable lands inventory. So you can see where general residential land is existing designated. And just updated the goal a little bit, because we're talking about all types of housing. See, I don't think we changed a lot of this. Added in number 6, providing opportunity for development of diverse housing choices with housing affordable at all income levels potentially. Really the only changes we made around general residential.
I had a quick question on
Mhm.
number 1. You strike the and other undesirable influences. Is there a legal reason we did that, or just because it felt it was outdated?
felt it was outdated, and who's to say what, I mean, it's a normative
Big
statement.
word.
Yeah.
It's not quantifiable.
Well, I was thinking hot shops and all that, but it's covered by other codes, so it doesn't matter.
That and it's also, yeah,
So it doesn't matter. Okay.
because everyone's opinion on what's undesirable is different, so it's so
I was
hard.
gonna say,
to-
maybe I'm an undesirable neighbor. You never know. You know, I'll
Probably-
pick on myself. Any comments on those? All right, suburban residential goals and policies. Here you've got a map that shows you where suburban residential is. You got a lot of it. And it is generally more on the outskirts of your community. We added the fact that, you know, accessory dwelling units, cottage housing, that kind of thing is what do you call it?
Loud.
Allowed.
Mhm.
Minimize the adverse effects on adjacent development through enforcement of subdivision regulations. I don't remember why we struck that.
Well, we do it anyway.
Okay, because you do it. And it doesn't need to be in here. Yes, ma'am.
First paragraph up there.
Mhm.
Create conditions suitable for moderate concentrations of people not in immediate proximity to public services, shopping, transportation. You don't want these people to have bus service through there or whatever.
Where are you exactly?
Sheet number 1.
Very
number one.
above that page.
Oh, okay. No, I think it's not that we didn't want those people to have bus services. I think it's that we didn't think about it.
I think that could be reworded as
Yeah.
transportation depots or park and rides. But you've got a park up there that has festivals and things, and I'd like people to be able to get up there, especially with maybe not quite enough parking.
So are you suggesting that I'm not quite,
You change it, instead of transportation,
uh-huh.
it could be transportation depots, transportation park and rides, but you know,
Shared transportation facilities.
There you go.
All right, thank you. I wasn't sure.
no, I just wanted to have transportation, hey.
No, that's fair.
Oh, it seems to me that number 1 is kind of a definition of suburb,
Uh-huh.
and it's just not well written.
It's not well written, you're right.
So how about we'll
been
take
there
a
a while.
closer look at that
yeah.
and rewrite it so
Yes.
that it's better written.
Yeah.
Make better.
We need to add anything about walkability here? We're on suburban, right? So,
We
yeah,
are on suburban.
sidewalks.
I mean, we could add
the
in
appropriate place.
concepts of sidewalks. I don't know, this is straying a little,
Well,
Over
because
the
that
top.
discussion is in the transportation system plan. So, and these being so overarching, there is talk later in some of the more, I want to say it's more specific where it requires development to pay for installation of utilities and public amenities.
I'm forgetting that particular thing. But how about we,
Development code.
Yeah, but I want to say it's a policy in one of the, go ahead.
how about we put in a question
there it
mark
is.
about being in sidewalks?
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, number 4 talks about encourage developers to allocate
Mhm.
land for open spaces and recreation.
And there are requirements for sidewalks, aren't there?
Yes, there are.
So,
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 46.
Yes. Uh-huh.
other thoughts here? Then I'm going to take us on. I'm appreciating your comments. Don't think I'm not. So the manufactured home residential goals and policies for that particular plan designation, it's a small one here. That's your map of where it is. And I think that we just didn't like the way that number 1, that first goal was written, and this is on page 49. And so, you know, concentrations of people living in manufactured homes. Um, so opportunities for development of manufactured home parks, including the other things that we could have in there. And all the references to the ordinance here, they were just excessive. So we're just leaving them where they're needed. And updating the fact that we don't have a commerce department anymore. We've got the Oregon Consumer and Business Services Department. Think we made any other changes there? I'm going to pause here for a moment. Those are your major policies for housing. Are there topics that you would hope that would be talked about in housing that you just haven't seen here that you'd like to see more of? And if you think of anything, you wake up at 3 a.m, you can tell Laurie.
The next day.
The next day. That's true. All right. Then we are going to go on to economic development. And again, we start with broad economic development goals and policies, and then we go on to the specifics of the different areas.
We do have 10 minutes.
We do have 10 minutes. I figure we can get through at least one of these. So does anybody have comments on these goals? And these are on page 50. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm happy to see 2 struck because I think what we actually want to do is look for opportunities of greater coordination with the county broadly. So I don't know if there's a way to include that.
So I'm established local control. Oh, okay. All right.
So like the opposite.
Okay.
So I think it was appropriate
Oh.
to strike it, but I think explicitly maybe for coordination. County economic development.
Which number are you on?
She's not on a number.
Yeah.
She's looking for something to be included.
Keeping the intent of.
We do have number, well, it's the policy. I don't know if we'd want to add something to the goal too. Policies for economics. Number 6 on page 51 has partner with other agencies, interest groups, and businesses in efforts to develop strategies for improving the local economy. So that sort of gets at partner with local agencies.
I was going to ask a question. Do you want a goal that is about partnership? And it would be beyond the county. You'd be talking about the port. You could be talking about state economic development agencies, that kind of thing. There's no, I mean, economic development is all about coordination. There's no harm in having that.
I would say something that's a little more outward.
Mhm. Mhm.
Coordination opportunities.
I think it's a good idea to have a goal that reflects.
Mhm.
See.
And then just last on number 2, kind of talking about like unfettered free market development without restrictions, but we do have a branding exercise. So do we want to somehow tie in that we want development reflect goals and direction branding in some way?
So this is maybe a comp plan is more about land use. You could have something about branding, but there's nothing that prevents you. Think about it this way. If you're looking at this in 10 years and you're looking at some branding thing, is it going to make any sense at that point?
Like building styles, you look at Sandy, you look at Bend, you look at
like sisters.
I don't think we're there yet. I think that might be, I mean, I know we're going into that.
just as this reads, it's kind of like unconstrained development without parameters.
Which one are you on?
Number 2, but
Ensure there's sufficient land and public facilities necessary to support economic development while allowing the free market to develop without restrictions when appropriate. So we tone that down a little bit. I think the when appropriate is an important phrase there. And the city, obviously, it has a lot of, we just talked about a lot of restrictions on economic development, on commercial development, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I thought about getting rid of the free market economy because that's kind of a little bit of an older phrase. But this is keeping the idea of having fewer restrictions when you can. which I think I've heard through some of the discussions seem to be some of what people want. But you've got a lot of requirements ready. I'm not saying you have too many requirements. I'm saying that this does not prohibit having requirements.
Prohibit driving.
No. No, and that's the kind of thing that once there's going to be a lot of discussion, I imagine, about that. And once you've got the agreement on that, you might consider adding a new policy the next time you update your comp plan.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking, just to reflect it once it's kind of been decided upon and there's very clear direction.
Yes, ma'am.
Ask, Mayor Joe Backus, in number 4, I think that's strong enough to describe how we want to partner up with OMIC and how we've been discussing.
So I'll just read it aloud. Capitalize on the comparative advantages identified in the EOA to maintain and attract commercial and industrial employment opportunities, building on opportunities related to OMIC and PCC. That's essentially what it says.
Yeah, it is one of our goals to work and continue working with OMEC and PCC.
I think we just talked about kind of widening that, not just a job, obviously workforce related and training and employment opportunities, but I think there's so much more in that partnership.
So tell me what more so I can think about what to add on here.
I think it's just as opposing to more of a partnership of city
So
in
building a stronger partnership.
building a stronger partnership and realizing different ways to how we can integrate or support MIC, or OMIC supporting the city as projects, integrating into the parks and recs are, I mean, there's so much opportunity out there. It's just, I don't want to limit it to person training and
And when you look at his overall plan, there's a lot there. I mean, other colleges as well, potentially OSUs, and you're limiting it to just PCC. I mean, is there a way?
You can add in, and other, and an other sort of statement.
I'm wondering if that goal should, or if that goal should just be broader and then address the other things as a policy.
Okay.
Or leave it as is and then or add a few things and then expand more specifically in the policy.
I mean, there is a specific policy on 51, number 9, that addresses that also.
I don't have any objection to any of this. I'm just trying to make sure I get it in my head. I mean, even if it was limited here, it wouldn't be limited.
In
It just
reality,
wouldn't be as
yeah.
good. So then I'm going to stop at this goal. And probably what we'll do is we'll bring this one back because this one isn't thought out well enough. And I want to get more feedback on it, on number 4 specifically and what we do with it. And then adding the piece about number 5, mixed use, pedestrian friendly. Just sort of what you guys are trying to do. That was probably out of the vision statement also. And so with that, I'm going to stop. At our next meeting, we will pick up back on these and talk through them a little bit more.
So those are the next steps.
That's the next steps.
I think we do.
fourth.
October 24th.
Yes, we will
See you
be
also.
back October 24th at 6 p.m. here to finish up our discussion on the comp plan policy. And potentially, if we have the revisions to the parking chapter ready, then we can bring that back as well.
That'd be great. And thank you for doing the red line as well, rather than having new and old. A lot easier to follow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Even when I create trash sentences. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Adjourn the
Thank you
meeting.
for being here.